years ago, 12 or 13 years ago. And it's quite interesting reading it now because various trends have become apparent in this last 12 or 13 years, and various happenings have occurred, and various movements have become more obvious. So it's quite a marvelous section, I think. And of course, what the first probably 2/3 of the whole section is dealing with the aspect of politics and economics, the political and economic power blocks into which the world is divided. And one senses in that respect, for the first time perhaps, a feeling of pessimism in Dr. Toynbee. He has reached no satisfactory conclusion in his own mind about how world peace can be achieved. And sometimes his remarks are almost sad. He talks even about a world dictatorship at one point. And he bases that opinion that probably world unification can only be achieved under a dictator on previous historic examples, when of course in various parts of the world there have been a certain extent unification, but only through that dictatorial power of one man. And gradually, Sensei, as the section goes on, brings Toynbee to consider religion more carefully, more deeply. And Toynbee first acknowledges that in a historical sense, religion has had something to do with regional unification. That is his first sort of step, that he does acknowledge that there has been some unification in the past, in history, through religion. And he quotes the Christian Roman Empire, the Roman Empire which became Christian, and indeed as a result of which Christianity was introduced into this country of ours. And he talks about Italy in the 19th century, when Catholicism had something to do with the unification of Italy into a country rather than a series of small principalities and states. He also points out that the Muslims achieved unification through unity, but based on their religion. But on the other hand, of course, that was accompanied by the sword. So the famous expression of the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other applied in that way. And Toynbee then talks about China, where unification has been achieved or had been achieved over many centuries, to some extent through religion, but religion combined with force, the subjugation, in other words, of the people. And he mentions Taoism and Confucianism and so on. So again, religion, even because of that summing up of the past, the importance of religion is gradually being emphasized, that it has had, in fact, a power of unification in the past, though that unification may have been somewhat impure. We'll consider that in more detail later. So Sensei leads on to that to talk about the present-day world, and he talks of the essential need for human interchange. He points out that although in the past the world seemed very large because communications were so difficult, now the world is very small, and therefore the situation is different. One country can affect another, even if they're both on opposite sides of the world. So Toynbee says, yes, that probably could help from a religious point of view. And finally, right at the end of this section, Toynbee agrees that to be successful in establishing a unified, peaceful world, religion could do it, but it must have the power of what Toynbee calls self-mastery. In other words, it must have the power to bring about what we would call the human revolution, in which we master our lives and our minds no longer master us. So, of course, Toynbee wouldn't know. He would probably, when he said that, feel that so far no religion had ever had the power to do that in a fully satisfactory way. And he was probably doubting that there ever could be such a religion to bring about that essential human revolution. So interestingly enough, literally just a few days ago, at the opening of the new year, the new academic year at Soka University, Sensei said this: the age of military power has already gone, and the age of economic power is passing away. From now on, we are entering the age of the power of culture. We are creating a great force in this respect, especially in Germany, France, Italy, and the UK. Interesting. I'll read it again in case you want to take it down. The age of military power has already gone, and the age of economic power is passing away. From now on, it is the age of the power of culture. We are creating, I think probably a better translation would be, we are beginning to create a great force in this respect, especially in Germany, France, Italy, and of course the UK. So he was naming the four major countries of Europe, which are also the four major countries in terms of membership of Nichiren Shoshu in Europe. So, in a way, that statement can be traced back to these much earlier thoughts of Sensei's, which he expressed 12 or 13 years ago in this dialogue with Toynbee. So now to move through the section as best we can, bringing out the major points, really. It begins, as I say, on a shallow level. It's shallow but important. That is to say, it's concerned with economic power, military power, not yet the power of culture and religion. And they first deal with the matter of international currency, because both of them agree that this is the major cause, apart from war, of course, but economically it's the major cause of instability. The fact that we haven't yet, as a human race, found the way to establish a stable currency which can keep the world in a stable condition. And they point out that if industry, trade and commerce are unstable, then inevitably it affects everything. Everything becomes unstable, because prices are constantly going up and down. So as you know, this is the sort of thing probably that we've been going through in this world ever since most of you were born, I guess. I doubt if you can remember times when there was a stable currency, if you had thought about it in your boyhood, which you probably didn't. But nevertheless, for years now, this has been the struggle ever since World War II, particularly. So the reason, of course, I'm sure you understand, is that fundamental, basic business, that is to say, trading, the passage of goods from one part of the world to another, or raw materials from one part of the world to the other, from which the goods can be manufactured. The currency, the tendency for the currency to constantly be changing upsets the apple cart totally. So my experience as a businessman, I was 20 years a businessman after leaving the army, was that there was never any peace at all. You moved as a businessman from one crisis to the next, and I'm sure it's exactly the same today, although I left business in 1977. Constantly moving from crisis to crisis, and the reason is always the instability of the currency or the exchange of money throughout the world. People order goods at a particular exchange rate, and then the exchange rate violently sometimes changes. The goods cost them twice as much. They have to put prices up everywhere to make their a reasonable profit, and so it goes on. So So it seeps through to every householder, every family, everyone that eats, which they all do. It affects everything. So this is a very, very important matter. And the problem really has arisen that as a human race, we haven't yet discovered the method of doing this, of establishing a stable currency. And for want of something better, it became, starting, I suppose, really with the Industrial Revolution, the custom to anchor currencies to the most powerful nation in the world, the most stable, the most powerful, yet, so people thought, therefore the most stable. So before World War I, certainly, and even just to some extent through World War II, between World War I and World War II, everything was anchored to the pound sterling. That was the stable currency, because the British nation was the most powerful in the world, therefore they had the most stable currency, therefore everyone else tended to anchor their currencies to it. By the end of World War II, that situation had collapsed. Britain was no longer the most powerful economic nation in the world, and the United States took over. So as from the end of World War II, the dollar has been the basis or the anchor point for all the currencies of the world. And of course, interestingly, since this was written, we've seen recently the results of that system and its failings very strongly, because the American economy is in a total situation of imbalance due to various pressures. I suppose you could say starting from the Vietnam War onwards. And the result is, of course, that the instability of the dollar affects the stability of every other currency. So, by and large, we're in a mess. We have these great crises on the stock exchange, which we saw recently, and so on. Everything up and down all the time. We see it even in our little bookshop over there at Richmond Centre, where books are ordered at a particular currency exchange rate. The yen is very strong, and we suffer because we're so hitched to the dollar nowadays. So the books are more expensive, far more expensive than they should be. So what is the solution? Everything is so easily upset, isn't it? By war, by internal political struggles, by weak leadership. We've seen all that happen in the States in the past 20 years. Vietnam, weak leadership, and struggles within, political struggles within. So it's far too sensitive a thing to anchor a currency just to one country. That's the great lesson. So Sensei then moves on to talk about, in a way, evolutionary development of unification, the evolutionary development of it. Toynbee says, frankly, having done a brilliant outline of the situation so far as the economies of the countries of the world are concerned, he says at the end of it, I have no solution to offer. So then Sensei talks about, first of all, the EEC. Long ago, he had a conversation or a dialogue with, I can never pronounce his name, Count...
Kudanev Calgary, wasn't it?
Some name like Kudanev Calgary. Anyway, he was the person who first established the EEC as a concept which was workable, and through his spirit, he died shortly afterwards, through his spirit, the European nations began to pull together and began to believe in the possibility of European unity. And so Sensei points out the incredible importance of this European experiment. Because if Europe, which was divided for 1,000 years by war and national antagonisms, if Europe can do it, then it's an example to the whole world, that other parts of the world could unify on a regional basis as a first step. So Europe is doing it. There are lots of hiccups and there are lots of stupid things that people seem to say, and you read them in the paper. But that European unity, which is still opposed quite strongly by some people in this country, is in fact, if you look at it with a broader view, an incredibly important first step. I think myself we're going to achieve it. I believe Europe will achieve it. I think, although there are all sorts of things go wrong at times and people malign it, that basically it is working and it is evolving. So our daimoku, I really feel, towards European unity is extremely important, don't you? Because it can be a pace setter for everyone else in the world. It can be a pace setter for South American economic unity, for example, or perhaps South American with North American, I don't know. It can be a pacemaker ultimately for East Asian unity. And I suppose one of these days, in the far distant future, we might even see Middle Eastern unity, but I guess that's going to be one of the last. But of course it comes back to the will of the individual, doesn't it? Especially in the West, where countries are mostly democratic, the will of the people has got to understand the importance of achieving zonal or regional unity, because if you can do that, then it's a stepping stone towards world unity. Basically, that's what it's all about. So I felt when I read that, the importance of our unity in Nichiren Shoshu, Sokugakai, SGI, is also crucially important, isn't it, for the actual unified economy of Europe. Because our daimoku, our actions, our words, when we're talking to other people, can carry great influence, even though there are only about 20,000 now practicing in Europe as a whole. It's still a small number, but the influence is great, and most of all, the influence of daimoku is so great. We don't realize that. It's difficult to believe. But if there are 20,000 people chanting daimoku, that is an incredible, powerful force. We sometimes forget that because you can't tangibly see it. We can't even see it at work in ourselves often. Other people have to see it in us. Other people will say, oh, you're always looking so fit and cheerful or whatever. We don't realize it ourselves. Perhaps it's a good thing we get huge big heads. But daimoku is the ultimate great weapon. And of course that leads to the other point, doesn't it? And the importance of spreading the teachings, bringing the Causton to others. So we play a crucial part in it. And without a doubt, that was in Sensei's mind when he said in 1974, towards the end of the year, what about the idea of having a European centre? We'd never thought about it. So preoccupied we were with our own, naturally, with our own activities and our own countries, Causton and Rufu. We were all tiny little groups. No one had thought about the idea of a European centre. But one can see now how important that is. And it is true, isn't it, that when you go to a Tretz, you somehow can't help yourself from being concerned with the peace and prosperity and happiness of the people of Europe. It just does that to you, because the Causton is dedicated to that. So the European experiment is important. And this, of course, is another reason why Sensei is placing such emphasis on Europe. Why Europe is so important to the peace of the whole world. Then he moves on to talk about Asia. Not such an easy problem. But whatever happens, Sensei emphasizes the importance of China. China, the greatest country in Asia, if you don't include the Soviet Union in it, which you have to some extent, but nevertheless the greatest purely Asian country, of course, is China, the vast country with an enormous population. And he talks about moving, what are the implications, if you like, of moving from what he calls bipolarity to multipolarity. Multipolarity meaning a zonal unification of a whole number of different countries. Well, Toynbee was an expert in China. He'd been there many times. He knew about the history of the whole world, but he probably knew about the history of China better than anyone else in his time. And he referred to China a lot in this book, all the way through. And they discuss this problem from a historical sense. They point out that apart from that period when China was attacked by foreign powers, that is to say by the Western powers, and then in their weakness Japan attacked them. And this is all recent in terms of history, within the last 100 or 150 years. Or apart from that period, China was able to maintain a stable rule over that vast country. It's an incredible achievement, really. For 2,100 years, China maintained a stable zonal or multipolarity federation. There were different states, quite different sorts of people too. We rather think of everybody in China being one person, but they're one type of people. They're not, in fact. There are all many different races or tribes involved in China. However, through the way they ruled, they kept this amazing stability. And they maintained good relations also throughout all that long period with their neighbors. So Toynbee felt that this was the virtue of the Chinese people, but points out that 2,100 years of maintaining stability, must have left its mark in the Chinese people today. That history behind them. Therefore, today also, their way of doing things, their way of achieving a stable nation, could be a lesson for others. So the Chinese empire remained peaceful for 2,100 years, but as Toynbee points out, all the other great empires of the world never lasted for more than 250 or 300 years in historical sense. That is to say, the Roman Empire, the Arab Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the British Empire, all caved in that comparatively, historically short period. So it seems that the Chinese have an ability, and both emphasize this point, both Toynbee and Ikeda, they have an ability to tolerate other nations and peoples than themselves, and to integrate with them. And there's a great example of that, of course, in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an amazing example of what the teamwork between two completely different races can achieve. The British and the Chinese together. They were a great partnership in Hong Kong. No doubt about that. And the way Hong Kong has got to where it is, which is in many ways an incredible achievement in a very, very short space of time, is largely to do to the ability of both those nations to get on together, though they come from opposite parts of the world. If you look at this country, you can see how well the Chinese people integrate. When I got back from having been abroad for a bit, it was amazing to me how, Chinese restaurants were everywhere. It used not to be so 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but now they're everywhere. Even in small country villages, the people somehow get on together. It's an amazing achievement. You walk out of Cambridge University, one of the colleges, great ancient colleges there, and there's a Chinese restaurant right opposite the main gates. This incredible thing. So they have this ability. And therefore the Chinese people have, great characteristics that can be extremely valuable to the whole world and in establishing world peace. So recently when Sensei was in Hong Kong, he said to the Hong Kong people, the Chinese people in Hong Kong, you really have to lead the way. He wrote a wonderful poem to them. Maybe we can publish it sometime in the UK Express. And he pointed out that they must lead the way towards Causton of East Asia. Because Causton of East Asia is really, in the end, Causton of China. So, as we've, I think, discussed before, there are, of course, lots of people practicing undercover in China. Maybe not openly, but inevitably every family in Hong Kong has relations in the mainland, and communication is quite easy, so it's not restricted. So there must be a great deal of talk about Buddhism, and I think a lot of people practicing there, but they're not doing so in the open yet. So really the influence of the Hong Kong members is very important for the future Causton of that part of the world. And everything, in Sensei's mind, gradually he's trying to persuade Toynbee the same thing, comes back to religion. Toynbee himself says another reason, apart from the innate characteristics of the Chinese people, these great good characteristics of being able to get on with other people and other races also arises from their religious past. Toynbee said that. From Confucianism, which is a form of humanism, and from Buddhism in China in its past history. In other words, even Taoism enables people to begin to think and contemplate the place of oneself as an individual in the universe as a whole. These are only all partial truths, but nevertheless they can have a good effect on human beings. And of course through Buddhism, also living in harmony with nature. So the Chinese people in their history had the advantage of these religious influences. Though, of course, each one of those religions was partial and each had weaknesses, but nevertheless they left something good. But they also, at the same time, did cause force to be used in order to keep that stability as well as religious teachings. The two went side by side. So therefore, I think one could say that at that point that the authors feel that China is equipped to be the center point of a tremendous federation of races in Eastern Asia. It can't, because it's so enormous, it can't be ignored. Unfortunately, there are also sorts of good points, though there are bad ones, of course, like any other race of people, but there are all sorts of good points on which to build such a federation, an economic federation, somewhat similar to the European community. So the European community's example of success is very important to the Chinese people and to everyone living in that area. So as you may know, Mr. Toda often talked, and if you read The Human Revolution, it crops up every so often, he often talked about the importance of the peace and happiness of the people of China. It was one of his great concerns in order to establish that multipolarization of that region in the world. So, of course, what the authors then lead to talking about is that if the Chinese people had to use force in order to achieve this amazing stability over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, how can we now achieve that same stability without using force, without oppression, or without a massive disciplinary system over the people? And I thought when I read that bit of Sensei when he first went on his first visit to China. He's visited China more than any other country in the world in the last 15 years. And when he first went to China, some of you may have heard, a press reporter, when he was leaving, asked him why he was going there. And he said, "I'm going to chant Daimoku in Peking." That was in around about 1974 or 5, his first visit. And that's what he went there for. Since then, he told us once that it was such a cold reception, his first visit. He wasn't greeted warmly. It was a struggle all the way. So he really did feel, of course he was trying to get to know people, but it was a painful experience. He wasn't really welcome. Japanese people as a whole were not welcome in China. It created dreadful suffering in that long, long war that went on from the 1930s right the way through to the end of World War II, virtually. So Sensei had to overcome that, and his first step was just to go to Peking and chant Daimoku. That was his most important thing. And as you may or may not know, it's now an acknowledged fact in Japan that the China-Japan Treaty, which was finally signed about 4 years ago, I think, the initiative was President Ikeda's. This is generally acknowledged. Through his perseverance, constantly going over there. And why did he do it? Because he was determined to fulfill his master's will, Mr. Toda's will. Mr. Toda said the peace of the people of China is vitally important to Causton of the world. So always in Sensei's mind was what that Mr. Toda said, and his determination to carry it out step by step. On his last visit, the Chinese Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party had very open, frank talks. Sensei said the difference was so incredible between his first visit and his recent visit, so warmly welcome now. And the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party asked him if he could help to take the initiative in solving the problem of North and South Korea, which the Chinese people are also worrying about. By getting to know people, bringing people together, establishing a link or as a go-between, just to establish trust and friendship, basically. So his influence there, through Mr. Toda's will, has been very strong. And of course that is all based on the power of his practice. So just recently, in his last visit also, the Chinese, one of the Chinese government ministers said, "Why don't you come over here and lecture to us about your wonderful Buddhism?" And Sensei said, "No. When you free religion and allow people to practice as they wish, then I'll come and lecture about Buddhism, but not until that time." Sensei pointing out the dignity of life, the freedom of mankind to worship as he believes to be right, is the fundamental principle that the Chinese government have got to recognize before he would ever go and spread the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. It's right, isn't it, when you think about it? So let's hope one of these days he does go and do it, because it'll mean the Chinese government is at last recognizing it. And as a matter of fact, they have taken steps in recent years, in the last 2 years, to open up religion a bit. They have allowed people to worship now, though they're not allowed to propagate. They're not allowed to spread whatever religion they practice. But things have improved, and there isn't the persecution which happened in the past. So, of course, in saying that, Sensei is not supporting what are partial or even erroneous teachings, of course not. But he's saying, even though, of course, he believes Nichiren Daishonin's teachings are right, but still the most important fundamental principle of Buddhism is the dignity of human life. Therefore, that has to recognize the right of people to practice what they wish. We try to persuade them to practice this Buddhism and to open their eyes, but we must always let them carry on with their thing if that's what they feel dedicated and insist on doing. Otherwise, it would become a religious sort of war almost. So I think if we can get anything out of this from the Buddhist point of view, it is our mission, definitely our mission, as the followers of Nichiren Daishonin in Europe, together with our European friends in other countries, to never forget the need for the unity of Europe, the need for the success of this experiment, so that it's an example to the rest of the world. And of course, a strong Europe can help to maintain balance between the superpowers, so long as those superpowers are superpowers, which one could well see, a change in that balance of power in the years to come. So, Sensei, by the time this sort of point had been reached, he then began to challenge him, Toynbee, quite directly. And I'm going to ask John to read on page 234, for those of you who've got books. All right, John?
In the present-day experiment in Western civilization, you said, a Chinese domination and colonialization of the entire surface of this planet is one of the possibilities that the future may hold in store for us. May I ask on what grounds you base this statement? Do you still feel